You probably take petrol at a pump for granted. But before 1978, getting fuel from Mombasa to Nairobi, it was basically an obstacle course designed to drain your patience and the country's money. Petroleum supply in Kenya started under British colonial rule in 1903. Back then, kerosene was king. In came tins, carried on sailing ships and early steamers, mainly for lamps in government stations and European homes. Gasoline followed for cars and generators, but remember, cars were rare and the generators, they were rarer. Shell was first on the scene, setting up a tiny storage depot at Shimanzi on Mombasa Island. It was just simple tanks, no automation. Fuel came from Persian Gulf refineries via the Suez Canal, then offloaded to drums, and eventually moved inland. Sounds simple, right? Not even close. From Shimanzi, fuel rode the Ugandan Railway north to Nairobi. Drums were stacked on flatbed wagons that were manhandled by loaders and often wrapped in sawdust to stop leaks. And boy, did they leak. 10 to 15% of the drums, they never made it intact. Roads were barely tracks, mudslides were common, and lorries from the 1920s, they struggled to reach the remotest stations. By the 1930s, plantations for coffee, sisal, and wattle, they had exploded. Demand shot up. Companies like Shell and Vacuum Oil, they started using small boats across Kilindini Harbour, then trucks or rail to move the fuel north. And the cost? Up to 20 shillings per ton mile. And also, breakage and evaporation losses, they were huge. World War II made things worse. Eastleigh Aerodrome, it needed aviation fuel. Shimanzi couldn't cope, so temporary barge transport was used. After the war, dock worker strikes in 1948, they meant Nairobi ran out of petrol for weeks. Imagine cars, buses, and factories stopped because someone didn't show up to work. Fast forward to independence in 1963. Kenya suddenly had a booming car population, 25,000 in 1960 and over 100,000 by 1970. Fuel imports jumped from 200 tons to nearly 1 million tons annually. Shell, Total, and Caltex, those ones dominated. Trucks now carried 10 to 20 ton loads along the Mombasa-Nairobi highway. Convoys of 50 trucks escorted by police, they crawled through Tsavo National Park. So many things were happening here. Axles snapped, spillages happened, fires happened, the bandits, they were siphoning fuel, and a single trip could take up to 48 hours. And kerosene for rural lamps, thousands of 20-liter tins moved by wholesalers on bicycles. Rural supply was a full contact sport. And the diesel for tractors, there was rail-to-lorry relays. The Kikuyu in me. Rail-to-lorry relays. There were rail-to-lorry relays because roads were too rough for long hauls. Then came the 1973 oil crisis. Prices quadrupled. Queues at pumps, they stretched for blocks. Black markets thrived, and feasibility studies showed tracking losses. There were 5 to 10% theft. There were over 200 accidents per year, and maintenance. It was costing 2 to 3 times what a pipeline would. Kenya's GDP growth was 7%, and yet fuel delivery was a mess. The government realized that the system was breaking. Roads eroded, convoys burnt out, depots ran dry, and factories idled. And the answer to all this, a buried secure pipeline. One that wouldn't care about rain, strikes, bandits, or overworked truckers. So in 1973, Kenya Pipeline Company was born. Its mission was to rationalize supply, reduce losses, and finally end the madness of drums, convoys, and oil-stained roads. Now in the next episode, we're going to be talking about how the pipeline was actually built, who ran it, and how Kenya moved from chaos to controlled fuel flow. But for now, just picture Nairobi in the early 70s. Hundreds of overloaded trucks crawling along dusty roads, a car owner praying his petrol didn't run out mid-journey, and the government realizing that if they didn't act, the economy, and probably your weekend drive, was going to grind to a stop. By 1973, the problem was obvious. Convoys of 50 overloaded trucks crawling 480 kilometers from Mombasa to Nairobi. There's also the problem of spilling thousands of liters, being hijacked, delays by rain, and burning up the government's budget. Now Kenya needed a solution, and that solution was a pipeline. The Kenya Pipeline Company, KPC, it was officially formed in 1973. Its goal was simple: transport petroleum safely, efficiently, and reliably from the coast to Nairobi, and eventually Western Kenya. But simple in Kenya, especially in the 1970s, was anything but simple. The first pipeline, called Line 1, It ran from Mombasa's Kipevu Oil Terminal to Nairobi, covering 480 kilometers. Construction started in the mid-1970s, with completion in 1978. It wasn't just digging and laying pipes. Engineers had to account for extreme terrain. There was Tsavo National Park's black cotton soil. Then there was also Athi River Hills and the seasonal floods. The pipeline used 16-inch diameter carbon steel pipes buried underground for safety and security. Pumping stations were installed at Mombasa, Mariakani, Voi, and Athi River, each staffed 24/7. These stations kept the crude moving at 10 to 15 kilometers per hour, ensuring continuous flow to Nairobi depots. Without them, the old convoys would have remained the only lifeline. Management-wise, KPC had a mix of government oversight and professional management. Early board members included Ministry of Energy appointees and experienced engineers brought in from Shell and BP, and that created a hybrid team. Day-to-day operations, they were run by a pipeline engineer corps trained in both foreign and local systems. Expansion began almost immediately. By the early 1980s, KPC added Line 2 to feed Western Kenya and storage depots in Nakuru and Eldoret. Later, Line 3 and 4 were commissioned to support growing industrial demand, particularly as mechanized agriculture and fuel-intensive industries expanded. Now, the pipelines were not just for petrol. They handled diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, and later LPG. Safety and technology were key. Leak detection systems were primitive at first. There were manual gauges, pressure checks, and patrols. But by the 1990s, KPC introduced SCADA systems, the supervisory control and data acquisition systems, allowing real-time monitoring of pressure, flow, and tank levels. This drastically reduced spill risk and operational losses, compared to the old drum and convoy system. Ownership and management evolved. KPC remained state-owned, but private contractors often handled construction, maintenance, and some storage logistics. Early managing directors included engineers with decades of experience in international petroleum logistics. One of the biggest challenges, corruption risk and procurement irregularities. Something that we're going to look into in the next episode. The pipeline also changed fuel pricing dynamics. Transport costs, they dropped dramatically. What once cost 20 to 30 shillings per ton mile via trucks and trains, it now costs a fraction. Delivery times dropped from 48 hours per convoy to less than 24 hours through the pipeline, with less risk of theft, spillage, or accidents. Urban and rural supply became more reliable, and this allowed Kenya's growing car fleet and industrial base to function without constant fuel crisis. KPC's early infrastructure included Mombasa to Kampala trunkline plants, eventually feeding Uganda and Rwanda. The infrastructure also included storage depots in Nairobi, Nakuru, and Eldoret. There were also pumping stations every 80 to 100 kilometers, and also in the infrastructure, there were maintenance yards for valves, hydrants, and tank repairs. By the late 1980s, KPC had transformed petroleum logistics in Kenya. Convoys were no longer the primary mode of transport. The pipeline network became the backbone of supply. The combination of state oversight, engineering expertise, and infrastructure investment that allowed Kenya to control costs, reduce losses, and secure fuel for decades. But the story didn't end here. Expansion created new challenges, the procurement choices, project costs, and government structures. Those were fertile ground for mismanagement. Billions would later disappear, scandals would rock the company, and accountability would become a national issue. We are talking about the scandals and the billions lost through Kenya Pipeline. By the 2010s, Kenya Pipeline Company was no longer just a network of buried steel moving fuel. It had become a stage where billions of shillings disappeared, contracts inflated, and oversight struggled to keep up. We're in the messy episode, so you know what? Just put on your seatbelt and hold tight. We'll do them in chapters. The first chapter is the JKIA hydrant pit valves scandal. And this was in 2014 to 2025. It all started in 2014. KPC planned to upgrade hydrant pit valves at the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, and there were about 60 valves plus spares. The contract, tender number SU/QT/3264F/14, that was awarded to Aero Dispenser Valves Limited, a company that on paper, it seemed capable. But on the ground, not so much. KPC ended up paying 550 to 660 million shillings, despite market rates being around 59 million. That's roughly 10 times the actual value. Partial upfront payment, 40% or 262 million shillings, that went to a supplier that had no pre-shipment documents or bill of lading. The valves arrived, they were non-compliant, and they sat unused in warehouses. EACC raids revealed even more. KPC finance head, he had 4 million shillings in cash at home. The procurement officer, Frederick Ogenga, and the Aero directors, they were convicted in January 2025 for conspiracy and abuse. This scandal alone, it accounted for a 550 million loss, fully documented and auditable, a rare instance where justice caught up, but only after more than a decade of mismanagement. The second chapter, or the second scandal that we are talking about, is the mega projects and inflated tenders. This was between 2018 to 2020. In 2018, the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee, PAC, it decided to take a magnifying glass to KPC's big-ticket projects. They looked at 12 mega projects, including the Kisumu Jetty. That one had 19 billion tied to it, and Line 5 Zakem, that had 30 billion shillings tied to it. That was alleging 70 to 95 billion shillings lost through inflated contracts and ghost payments. KPC's managing director at the time, he denied any losses, but EACC and PAC dug in. The questions here were, why were hydrant valves inflated tenfold? Why were the Line 5 payments in the billions continuing, despite overpayments? And why were audits flagging millions in unexplained charges? The investigation stalled when the managing director, Joe Sang, when he resigned. But Parliament's message was clear. KPC could no longer act as a cash cow with little oversight, and some contracts were suspended, though recovery was slow. The third scandal that we are talking about is the KPRL payments and takeover. This was between 2013 to 2023. While everything is happening, another scandal simmered quietly. Payments to Kenya Petroleum Refineries Limited, KPRL. KPRL was effectively defunct, but KPC continued to pay 1.3 billion shillings annually in storage fees. PAC hearings in 2018 exposed these payments. The committee questioned why KPC kept transferring funds for tanks that weren't even in use. EACC and PAC investigations, they dragged on for years. Parliament escalated action. KPRL's 384 million litres of storage, they were to be transferred to KPC. The acquisition was completed in 2023, consolidating KPC's storage capacity and finally ending unnecessary payments. But pre-acquisition payments were still queried by OAG, meaning accountability lagged far behind reform. The fourth scandal that we are looking at, asset impairments and historical audits. This was in 2014 to 2022. Now don't think that scandals were just contracts. Infrastructure itself raised questions. OAG audits between fiscal year 2014 and fiscal year 2022, they repeatedly flagged KPC's PPE, property, plant and equipment. It was exceeding 85 billion shillings. Examples here include the Line 1 Mombasa to Nairobi pipeline. Here, there was impairment of 333 million shillings due to aging infrastructure and neglect after the 2011 Sinai explosion critiques. There was also the LPG Mombasa facility. Here, there was a 193 million shilling impairment. Then also, in the new Kipevu oil terminal, 13.2 billion shillings lacked operational frameworks or deeds. And lastly, there were court awards and administration costs. Here, 885 million shillings was hidden in general expenses. And to add salt to the injury, land ownership problems compounded matters. The land allocated in the 1970s to 1990s, and that was worth 42.35 million shillings, those lands lacked deeds. The Embakasi Depot land, this one was worth 5.21 billion shillings. It was titled under Kenya Airports Authority. This land is very problematic. There were also encroached 42 acres. These ones were worth 625 million shillings. They highlighted gaps in over 15.78 billion leasehold land. Now these were not one-off issues. Fiscal year 2014 Office of the Attorney General, it noted Zakem Line 5 overruns and subcontractor breaches settled out of court. About 634 million shillings. Non-core assets like the Mzima Springs Water Project, they were questioned for value. PAC eventually directed full forensic re-evaluations ahead of any IPO, and SCADA technology helped reduce operational losses to 0.06%. There are still other scandals that we can just mention or look at, though these ones are smaller but significant. First of all, there was the delayed Kipevu payments causing temporary shortages and liquidity issues. Second, there was procurement irregularities in fuel storage spares outside JKIA valves. Third, there were double handling losses not accounted for in earlier audits, costing millions yearly. All this is showing us a consistent pattern. Infrastructure was solid, operations ran, but governance and oversight lagged behind, and that left gaps where money leaked. So when we look at all these scandals, we can say that the pipelines, the KPC's pipelines, those ones were reliable, but the governance, billions were lost due to inflated tenders, phantom contracts, and legacy mismanagement. Auditors and parliament intervened, but often after the theft, convictions, freezes, and takeovers, they fixed some issues. But delays meant long-term inefficiencies and reputational damage. By the mid-2020s, Kenya Pipeline Company had transformed. After decades of scandals, overpayments, asset mismanagement, and parliamentary interventions, the company now operates with far tighter oversight, modern systems, and a strategy aimed at expanding Kenya's role in regional oil logistics. Today, KPC manages a network of pipelines spanning Mombasa to Nairobi, Nakuru, Eldoret, and Western Kenya, with pumping stations at key points. The storage capacity has grown to over 1.14 billion litres following the full KPRL acquisition in 2023. So we have had several reforms here. First, the SCADA monitoring. This was introduced to track flow, pressure, that drastically reduces leaks, theft, and operational losses. Today, reported losses are 0.06%, and that's a dramatic drop from previous decades. The second reform is the forensic audits. The ongoing OAG-guided audits, they ensure asset values are verified, with irregularities addressed promptly. Past issues with land ownership, impaired assets, and incomplete valuations, they are being systematically corrected. The third reform is governance and oversight. The PAC and EACC oversight, it has tightened. Procurement processes are more transparent, and management now requires detailed documentation before approvals. The days of ghost contracts and 10 times overpayments, they are being replaced with accountability structures. Then also, operational efficiency has improved dramatically. Pipelines now handle petrol, diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, and LPG reliably. That reduces reliance on trucks and rail, which were prone to accidents and theft in the pre-1978 era. Fuel reaches Nairobi and other key cities within hours, not days. And the risk of hijackings or spills, they have sharply declined. But even with the reforms, challenges still remain. We have aging infrastructure. You know, some lines, especially the line 1 from Mombasa to Nairobi, they require ongoing maintenance to prevent failures and leaks. Past neglect means pipelines built in the 1970s still need careful oversight. Then we also have a challenge of regional integration. You know, East Africa is expanding its oil ambitions. Uganda, South Sudan, and Rwanda, they all need secure export routes. KPC must negotiate rights of way, tariffs, and cross-border regulations, all while competing with private pipelines. Then another challenge is the environmental risk. You know, pipelines run through sensitive areas like Tsavo, Athi River, and wetlands. Climate events and land encroachments, they continue to pose operational risks. So what's the future of oil routes in East Africa? KPC's role is increasingly regional. Plans are underway to connect Kenya's network with Uganda's and potentially South Sudan's crude production. That will turn Mombasa into a regional energy hub. The challenges here are political, technical, and financial. The political challenge. You know, agreements with neighboring countries, they require stable governance and conflict mitigation. Past disputes in pipelines across East Africa, they demonstrate how fragile cross-border projects can be. Then the technical challenge of this is expanding pipelines for crude exports. It involves high-capacity pumping stations, corrosion-resistant steel, and precise engineering to handle long-distance pressure drops. And the financial challenge. Investments run into billions of shillings. Private and public partnerships, foreign investment, and long-term government support are crucial. Missteps risk the same issues KPC faced historically. You know, the overpayments, inefficiencies, and corruption. First lesson that we learn, engineering can be perfect, but governance matters a lot. The pipelines moved fuel efficiently, but billions were lost due to poor oversight. Modern SCADA systems and audits prevent repeat mistakes. Another lesson that we learn is parliamentary and anti-corruption oversight work. PAC, EACC, and OAG interventions, they force accountability, even if it was delayed. The third lesson that we learn is strategic vision matters. The pipeline became the backbone for industrial growth, and now a potential regional hub. Now the company has evolved into a hybrid of engineering efficiency and governance-conscious operations, but vigilance is key. Future expansions and cross-border projects, they must maintain transparency just to avoid repeating the billions lost era. Now I feel like doing another documentary showing you guys how Kenya is the fuel hub of East Africa, and maybe we can understand more about fuel, KPC, and all the gaps in between. So I'll see you guys in that other documentary. If you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel, just make sure you subscribe, because that's like the easiest way you can support me when you're gonna one of my subscriptions. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It also encourages me to do more videos. Thank you all so much for the support. I read all your comments. Again, they mean so much to me, and they make me think, because some comments I have to really think. Zingine hadi na Google just to understand and see. Oh yeah, and to answer another question, so many people keep asking, am I a journalist? Am I a journalist? Yes, I did journalism as a science, and I think inajionyesha, like it's now coming out. I never thought I would ever be in front of the camera. Maybe behind, I've done work behind the camera, behind the scenes. But right now I am in front, and let me just say it's destiny.